Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you about some aspects of Kondylis's philosophical, historical works that this can only be a kind of abbreviated introduction of some aspects naturally, since just taking the two books that you mentioned, the book on the Enlightenment as well as the one on the critique of metaphysics, they uh, both count about 1,300 pages. And if you actually take into account that the dissertation of Kondylis was basically a combination of the book on the Enlightenment as well as on his earlier book on the um, development or um, coming into being of the dialectics, especially with regard to Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling, as a kind of prehistory of Marxism, then you can easily see that this is not going to be very easy to give a kind of short introduction. And my own take on this is that, of course, when you look at the Enlightenment as a phenomenon in the early modern European history, especially, it is clear that enlightenment as such is not always easy to define. There are two different kinds of approaches that are intermingled all the time, namely, when you look at the historiography, that enlightenment can be regarded as a kind of period description, as a kind of historical phase in modern European history, but it can also be a kind of project that has not yet reached its end. And many people who are interested in the Enlightenment do so because they also share basic values that are often thought to be part and parcel of the Enlightenment. But there's also another feature of the Enlightenment that needs to be kept in mind, at least, namely that there's always been some kind of internal, external critique of the Enlightenment, sometimes under the rubric of the dialectics of Enlightenment. And you only have to think about names like Horkheimer, Adorno, but also Foucault, Rousseau, Leo Strauss, Gomez Davila, and other people to understand that there is something at issue here, and that it is often always necessary to take into account different forms of enlightenment and its relation to foundational values, human rights, and also its possibility to develop into some sort of nihilism. And it is precisely this character of enlightenment as something that is not easy to define that makes it interesting also to look at Panajotis Kondylis' interpretation of this particular period in history, because he has tried to determine not so much perhaps a basic principle of enlightenment, although he has also claimed that the major thrust of the Enlightenment, as he understood it, was to achieve a kind of rehabilitation of sensuality, Rehabilitation der Sinnlichkeit. And in order to achieve this kind of aim, the Enlightenment thinkers and propagandists used certain kinds of arguments and tried to develop polemical tactics in order to uh, um, bring about certain conditions. But there is another issue in this connection that is important to note, namely that for Kondylis, arguments are not something to be taken only at their face value. And that means that you always have to consider the kind of constellation in which certain arguments are employed. And I'll try to mention a little bit about this, although I should warn you that there are very many detailed interpretations in both of Kondylis's books dealing with particular thinkers that are often not very well known. So it's impossible to go into these thinkers in detail, but it's important to note that the form of Enlightenment thinking has very close connections also to the history of the development of a critique of metaphysics, and it changes accordingly, not only with regard to what it wants to achieve, but also who it has to fight in order to gain some sort of power. And one basic principle that Kondylis tries to apply in his historical research is to understand what kind of means philosophical position has to develop in order to fight sometimes on various fronts. And the Enlightenment is therefore composed of very or sometimes seemingly different ideas. So, for example, in the uh, uh, early phases, for example, of Enlightenment thinking, it may well have been the case that skepticism was used by theological thinkers in order to protect theological truth or metaphysical truth against the attacks of reason, so that they could not be uh, undermined by reasonable arguments. But these same skeptical arguments could also later be used by others to attack different positions. And Kondylis tries to show in various ways that many Enlightenment philosophers fought a kind of double battle against traditional metaphysics on the one hand and atheism on the other hand, for example, Voltaire. Um, and this also explains in part the critique that people like Denis Diderot launched against philosophers like La Métrie, whom Kondylis regarded as a kind of nihilist, even drawing parallels to the Marquis de Sade. This has been disputed, and I'm not going into this, but the very important key point to keep in mind here is that Kondylis has a very strong methodological um, focus on what you might call polemology. So looking at the polemics that are inscribed into certain kinds of positions. And that goes particularly for the metaphysics dimension. For example, in the early modern period, going back even to the late Middle Ages, he tried to um, find the early beginnings of a tendency towards the critique of metaphysics that would feed into the Enlightenment by looking at those thinkers influenced by nominalism who tried to fight against abstractions and trying to draw conclusions from this so-called universals controversy, Universalienstreit, about whether one can legitimately apply abstractions to uh, some kind of group of individual things that exist. And in the course of this development, Kondylis argued metaphysics became no longer a kind of ontology that was dealing with the nature of being and the first principles of being, but it developed into a different form of something that was mostly only concerned with the principles of knowledge. So moving from ontology to epistemology, and later this movement could be described as that, but that already goes then into the 19th century, into historical sociological attempts to deconstruct metaphysics, if you like, for example, in Marxism or in anthropological theories that try to um, uh, look at metaphysics by claiming that they are not true, but fulfill some deep-seated anthropological needs. Now, um, of course, um, when Kondylis looks at the Enlightenment, he tries to distance himself from other thinkers like Ernst Cassirer, Paul Azar, Peter Gay, who had written about the Enlightenment, and he does this, of course, also to polemically sharpen his own view, to make his profile as an Enlightenment researcher more distinct. And he thinks that the main thrust of the Enlightenment implies a discussion of the relationship between the mind or Geist and sensuality. And this is for him the crucial, um, the key moment around which everything turns. And this particular rehabilitation of sensuality also functions as a kind of Weltanschauungswaffe, as a kind of weapon in the service of a worldview, Weltanschauung, that attacks theological orthodoxy and morality. And the polemical nature of Enlightenment thinking is, of course, the reason why it is not possible to uh, construct an image of the Enlightenment that is true for every period of the Enlightenment, and that is true everywhere in different countries of where the Enlightenment took place. But it is still a kind of heuristic approach to see how different philosophical parties react to this particular theme. And when Kondylis writes about the metaphysics problem, it has sometimes been claimed or argued that he does not really give a very clear definition of metaphysics, but in his book on the critique of metaphysics, he mostly claims that there is a kind of uh, difference that metaphysical thinking opens up between transcendence and immanence, and that within the metaphysical frame of thinking, the transcendent is always the immanent, and that therefore, if you want to criticize metaphysics in the sense of something more than merely empirical, you have to attack the idea of transcendence, or of something something that you can actually know about transcendence. And that is why, going back to the Middle Ages, the idea of what can be ascribed to scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, that you can have a kind of more or less transparent system of the whole, is the first thing that needs to be attacked. And one other feature that is very important for Kondylis's concept of enlightenment, but also of metaphysics in general, is that every uh, metaphysical doctrine combines statements about the nature of being, that's a kind of ontology, and about values, that means normative elements that somebody wants people to strive for or to establish. And in this interpretation by Kondylis, this features very strongly, namely that he claims basically that every metaphysical or even philosophical position is always also a claim to power by those who uh, put it forth. A claim to power in the sense that if you claim that metaphysics is linked not only to statements about fact, but also to statements about value, this means that you derive certain normative claims from statements of fact, and therefore you want other people to adopt these particular metaphysical notions because you want them to follow the precepts for actions that can allegedly be derived from these ontological insights. So that is a very crucial element in this kind of interpretation. And in Kondylis's view, this explains also the social nature of philosophical thinking, which means that he also has a kind of anthropological thesis in the background, namely that uh, always human beings living in social circumstances try to force other people to adopt the views that they themselves hold. And this, in the final consequence, is due to the fact that in this idea of social ontology, you need some kind of coherent or unified concept of the world in order to make communication and a social compact possible. Now, by uh, taking into account the polemological or polemical nature of thinking, this translates directly into Kondylis's methodology, and he expresses this very clearly by saying that the best way to understand any kind of philosophy in a historical way is to get to understand um, what kind of enemy or opponent this philosophy has, and what this kind of philosophy needs to prove against this opponent, or not only what it needs to prove, but what it wants to prove against a particular opponent in order to uh, eliminate him, basically. To eliminate this opponent, it could be a theology or the theologians holding this theology or other people who also purport to be part of the Enlightenment. For example, I mentioned the example of La Métrie. Many Enlightenment thinkers, in order to further their own project of the Enlightenment, were very eager to fight against atheists because they thought that if this sort of ideology became too prominent and popular, it would threaten the whole project. And therefore, one needs to take into account what certain thinkers want to achieve. So there's always not just a kind of theoretical interest, but also a practical interest. And I think that's one of the key points also in Kondylis's approach, generally speaking, that he thinks that the vita contemplativa is basically also a kind of construct, since even in the sphere of the spirit or mind, uh, struggles have to be fought. Now, this could, of course, also relate to various kinds of areas of philosophy or philosophy of nature and so on, about which I don't want to say anything here. But the different interpretations of what rehabilitation of sensuality could mean can be seen in the different theories that have to be developed in the Enlightenment. If you look at Rousseau or Herder or Locke or La Métrie or the Marquis de Sade or even Fichte. And the explanatory project of Kondylis is basically trying to make sense of the divergence of attitudes in the Enlightenment by looking in detail at what these particular thinkers try to do in order to fight both theological orthodoxy and what they perceived as the threat of nihilism if um, every kind of metaphysics was basically destroyed. And Kondylis, I think, makes it very clear in different places that one of the key assumptions behind his own non-normative approach is basically that the world as such does not have value or meaning, but these kinds of descriptions of meaning and value are necessary for human beings to survive, and therefore they do not really have a kind of ontological quality, but rather also a kind of functional uh, quality. Now, because of this polemical situation, every Enlightenment thinker is necessarily in a kind of friend-enemy grouping, and the fights that have to be fought here are, of course, always fought in the name of truth, but precisely because they are polemical, uh, even theoretical conceptions cannot be purely uh, guided by concern for the truth, but they have to be uh, also guided by political considerations, if you want to express it like that. And that means that political uh, aspects are inscribed into the Enlightenment discussions or into every philosophical debate from the beginning. It's not possible to exclude these things. And that is also one feature that one should keep in mind, perhaps, when Kondylis talks about the Enlightenment and tries to, if you like, apply some sort of ideology critique to Enlightenment theories, he does not have a practical intention or expectation in the sense that he wants people to act in a certain way, to namely expect, for example, that one could bring larger amounts of people to accept a very sophisticated understanding of enlightenment. He sees very clearly that will not be possible through scholarly endeavors to eliminate from the sphere of politics attempts to claim we are the enlightened ones and you are the dark enemies of the Enlightenment, and so on. This will be a feature of political life, according to Kondylis. Also in the future, there's no reason to believe that this will stop. So this, I think, shows the basic understanding of Kondylis as someone who wants to understand what is happening, but who does not expect any practical consequences from this in the sphere of human social living. Okay, so this has direct consequences, of course, for every discussion about what freedom means, what necessity means, what causality means, because they also need to be considered in their polemical structure. And um, so the problem that one has to keep in mind here is that terms can be uh, how could you say, revalued in the process of discussions. So that is a kind of polemical reinterpretation, Uminterpretation, is what he says in German. So, for example, you could argue against Christian orthodoxy by claiming that the human capacity for knowledge is limited. So that's what I already mentioned earlier in connection with skepticism. And this kind of skepticism is not in itself necessarily a part of the Enlightenment, but it is used by the Enlightenment in a strategic manner in order to puncture pretensions, pretentious claims of knowledge that play a great role in all intellectual discussions. And this is also part of the discussions in the early modern period between different kinds of systematic approaches, for example, Cartesianism and anti-Cartesianism. So in view of certain theological positions, it is possible to say that one gains more power if one applies a kind of Cartesian or a mathematically oriented system. But then on the other hand, if you want to rehabilitate sensuality, you also have to, in a second step, criticize precisely these mathematically oriented models of understanding of the world. And uh, this is something that shifts and is also connected to the different views, for example, about the social role of the church. And Kondylis has occasionally pointed out that, for example, the critique of metaphysical abstractions that developed over centuries uh, turned ironically into a kind of argument against the Enlightenment in the early 19th century, or at least after the French Revolution, when, for example, the conservative or reactionary opponents of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution charged the proponents of the Enlightenment and of the idea of human rights and of natural right, the natural rights, equal natural rights of everyone. They charged them with being metaphysicians who were arguing from concepts like the human being, although nobody has ever seen a human being, but only concrete people like Frenchmen, Englishmen, etc. So this is one example where the ironical turn of arguments has a clear application and can be turned against the Enlightenment as well. One such argument also concerns the materialism of the Enlightenment, which could be used strategically to fight against the idea of God, maybe. But that also leads one into difficult discussions concerning individual thinkers. For example, when Hobbes claims that God is a body or something like that, then of course this leads to all kinds of difficult problems. But in principle, if you establish some sort of materialist, atheist monism, then you could say that this is a feature of the Enlightenment. For example, in the interpretations of the radical Enlightenment by Jonathan Israel. But Kondylis, I think, does not share this view because he rejects mostly all kinds of positions that fix the Enlightenment too much to a certain substantial uh, concept of what the world looks like. Okay. Now, um, in this connection of the rehabilitation of sensuality, the Enlightenment, according to Kondylis, has put a strong emphasis on the naturalness of human beings or man, the fact that human beings are completely beings of nature and do not partake of some kind of transcendence or have an origin that is more than naturalistic. And this is, of course, something that can be employed against traditional theology. And it is also an element of the anti-intellectual part or key feature of the Enlightenment. So for Kondylis, this kind of context is important for understanding Rousseau, for example, because he thinks that when Rousseau argues against the intellect or against the rule of the intellect, this is not meant to be an argument against the Enlightenment, but an argument against the very intellectualism that was already in existence before the Enlightenment. And in this sense, for example, for Kondylis, Rousseau was not an enemy or an opponent of the Enlightenment, but an organic element of the Enlightenment itself. So uh, if one wanted to look closer at what Kondylis does in this connection, one would really have to go into the study of some particular thinkers, and he deals with different thinkers that I simply cannot mention here. Also, with regard to the earlier Renaissance period, sometimes drawing on philosophers who are not well known or could not be regarded as classics normally. But what he does not do is, for example, take into account so much literary texts, although that would be an interesting part, and maybe I can mention one example where I find this of particular relevance. Now, one example that he mentions in order to explain or illustrate his view of how one and the same argument could be used for different purposes is linked to two very important thinkers of the 18th century, namely David Hume and Johann Georg Hamann in Germany, because they were both thinkers who were engaged with Christianity and with the question of belief and faith. And whereas Hume was very much a kind of critic of the belief in miracles and tried to show that faith or belief, this is a kind of problematic concept here, that they are basic for understanding the world. And Hamann did not hold the same views as Hume, but he also used Hume's concept of belief in order to defend his faith into Christian theology or into to Christian beliefs and so on in a way that actually affirmed Orthodox Lutheranism, which something which Hume obviously did not do. And the same kind of arguments, although creatively reinterpreted, could then be made use for different purposes in connection with the affirmation or negation of religious truth. Okay, this is one key feature, perhaps. And I already mentioned the fact that Enlightenment as a double structure, project, and period is something that makes it, in a sense, lively or something that is not over when the period of enlightenment is over, for example, because the decline of the West or something has happened, but it's a kind of thing that can always be reinvented. And in this sense, for example, Kondylis um, understands himself as someone who partakes in various ways of the Enlightenment thinking, of course, this kind of critical analysis of metaphysical concepts and the social function that these concepts have, they can also be found in Kondylis, but what he does not share with thinkers that are sometimes connected to the Enlightenment is this strong moral impulse. So, for example, one could say that Kondylis, in a sense, tries to understand social connections, social structures and organizations, and the way in which they are also philosophically relevant, in which they are expressed in philosophical discussions. But whereas, for example, Thomas Hobbes, in his analytical political philosophy, tried actually to bring about peace for human beings by establishing a kind of political order that would neutralize the fight of everyone against everyone. This was absolutely not the case with Kondylis as a philosopher. He did not have this kind of political ambition, uh, claiming or thinking that by analyzing the different forms that Enlightenment thinking, that the critique of metaphysics can take, he would in any way further the progress of peace and prosperity or something like that. So that was a different kind of enlightenment that he tried to develop more on the intellectual level. Now, one could, of course, now go also into some aspects that need some further exploration. I have already, in a different context, mentioned one example where it is interesting to see how the different kinds of arguments could be employed. I was referring to Goethe, for example, who was reading one of the major materialist treatises of the 18th century, d'Holbach's System of Nature, and he regarded this as a very dark and depressing book. And in the same time, when he read this particular book, he became acquainted with the plays of Shakespeare and began to read Shakespeare, and then uh, tried to, and you can read this up in his autobiography, he tried to fight against this kind of materialism of d'Holbach by claiming that Shakespeare was the great poet of nature who was able to escape from this dark atheistic night in your mind as well. And this is just one example of how one could extend this interpretation of the Enlightenment into the field of literature that was basically ignored by Kondylis necessarily because obviously he had already written about too many different other things. I may perhaps add some aspects that relate more closely to this issue of the critique of metaphysics to recapitulate, namely that here one can also see his own position with regard to other critics of metaphysics. As you will remember, I said that the beginnings of this critique of metaphysics are located or situated by Kondylis in the late Middle Ages and then develop along certain lines until the positivists and logical positivists of the 20th century take up the kind of critique of metaphysics, combining different forms of critique, for example, linguistic critique, and also a critique developed by people like Ernst Topic in Austria and Germany in the 20th century, trying to show that all metaphysical notions derive from a kind of pre-rational combination of values and claims about ontology. And it's very interesting to look at the ways that Kondylis discusses, for example, Topic, whom he also criticizes in certain points, but I can't go into this right now. Now, uh, again, the nature of metaphysical thinking, according to Kondylis, implies some kind of claim to power. I've mentioned this again and again, and this is true because the construction of a theoretical whole always serves a purpose that has more than just intellectual reasons, and therefore um, uh, the analysis of the development of metaphysics is very important for Kondylis, not because he thinks that one uh, could merely state the death of metaphysics or to prophesy the death of metaphysics or deplore the death of metaphysics. Everything like this, all this has been done. But he thinks that even though there is no empirical basis in these metaphysical claims, you cannot ever get rid of them. And at the end of his book on the critique of metaphysics, he even says that it's not even possible to exclude that in the future, traditional metaphysics may be again uh, develop and gain some kind of power. That is not something that can be excluded logically or empirically. And uh, so even though if kind of metaphysics could be revived according to this view, um, what precise form this kind of metaphysics would take is also impossible to predict. And of course, the development of science, the development of certain other ideologies plays a role in what might be possible here. So um, mm, I don't want to repeat my argument about skepticism, but the point about agnosticism is also perhaps worth mentioning, namely that the claim that you cannot really know something in the abstract leads to basically the charge that metaphysics may be true to a certain extent, but for example, if you say that which is, this is obviously true, but according to this metaphysical or this view of the critics of metaphysics, it's basically useless and it's vain. And in the early modern period, there have been some thinkers, like one Kondylis mentions, Nizzolio, is otherwise not very well known. These kinds of philosophers in the wake of humanists like Lorenzo de Valla have already claimed that most metaphysical notions are merely rhetorical abstractions and do not refer to any empirical reality. And therefore, one should get rid of metaphysical notions, and in a sense, nothing much that the positivists of the 20th century have written about this issue cannot be found in these earlier thinkers of the Renaissance period. But these thinkers were largely unknown to later Enlightenment thinkers, according to Kondylis, and therefore this kind of rhetorical criticism became a common parlance, if you like, and nobody in the 18th century studied the medieval thinkers and the Aristotelian metaphysics that was often regarded as the source of all these thinkings, but they were of thoughts, but they were basically dealing with popular notions about worthless abstractions, vague concepts, and futile reasonings about irrelevant things. Okay, perhaps one or two last remarks. Again, metaphysics can be regarded in this view first as a kind of abuse of language, and it can also be regarded as a kind of uh, expression of historical or sociological facts. That is mostly what is linked later to Marxism and anthropology in some sense. And it is also something that explains why one can, on the one hand, claim that metaphysical notions are illusions, but on the other hand, that they are necessary for human beings to survive in a world in which they have to live together in social forms. Kondylis has many more things to say about different thinkers, but I will stop here and just um, ask you for any questions you might have. Perhaps I can answer them, but perhaps it's just a way that helps you to get a little bit closer to what Kondylis has thought as a philosopher of historian of philosophy, maybe a philosopher of history, but that's another matter. So thank you very much.
Dr. Kinzel, thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for any questions. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Kinzel, for the fascinating presentation on Kondylis metaphysics. I guess my question is one that is not particularly unusual given Kondylis's project. Is that can we safely assume that Kondylis' entire architectonic of a kind of philosophical, or rather a reconstruction of metaphysics, is itself a metaphysical project, given that it relies on some primordial notions with regards to power, aggrandizement, and decision? And if this is the case, would Kondylis's project would be exempt from the criticisms that he launches against the mediation of power claims and interests within all metaphysical systems? Thank you.
Yes, this is of course the question that first comes to mind, and I did not address this obviously because it leads you to very many different things. I mean, the first reviewers, for example, of his book on the criticism of metaphysics has argued precisely that Kondylis basically puts forth his own metaphysics of anti-metaphysics, and this would be in line in a certain sense with his own thinking, because he has shown again and again in his study that the critics of metaphysics have taken up structures of thought that were developed by metaphysical approaches. And I try to point this out by drawing attention to his claim that even the critics of the Enlightenment took over this anti-metaphysical structure of arguing against the Enlightenment, even though this kind of argument was in earlier centuries used by the Enlightenment thinkers to attack traditional religion. And so, of course, if you look at other writings by Kondylis, they have a very high degree of abstraction. For example, especially his writing on power and decision, and also his commentaries on thinkers like Thucydides and others, as you just mentioned. They argue with certain human propensities, anthropological, um, sociological key notions. And I myself would also say one should be a little bit hesitant about thinking that you can get rid of metaphysics, even if you write about it critically, because mostly unacknowledged metaphysical notions will creep in fairly quickly. And of course, if you look, for example, at the way that Kondylis interprets individual thinkers, this one particular, I think I need to check the name again because he's not a household name, Nizzolio. He already many hundreds of years ago argued that in this kind of nominalist sense that there is no entity, of course, but if you speak about man or human beings, then this also abstracts from individuals, and there are only individuals. And of course, once you begin to philosophize and to argue about these things, if you argue about general underlying structures, if you try to construct the history of philosophy in the way that I try to make clear to a certain extent, then it's difficult for me to accept that you could ever escape from metaphysical thinking. And of course, the traditional metaphysicians would not be impressed by the argument that if you say that which is too abstract to make use of in any meaningful sense, because they would say this is precisely the kind of intelligible nature of certain things that are that it is possible to regard them under this aspect of intelligible generality, if you like. And this is classical metaphysics, and a classical metaphysician, let's say, building on Aristotle, would not regard this as a conclusive argument to say, well, this is merely abstraction and rhetoric. So there's a lot to be discussed here, I think, and you need to know a lot about these different kinds of discussions. And but Kondylis was very skeptical, let's say, about the attempts. For example, in the 20th century, there was a book by a German philosopher, something like Die Wiederkehr der Metaphysik or something like that. So the return of metaphysics. And he thought that this was more or less useless. He was not impressed, but others may view this differently.
Thank you.
If I could comment on that, I thought it was interesting that if you look at the bibliography of The Political in Man, he cites a lot of anthropology and like very like traditional classical anthropological texts like The Gift. And it seems to me that a lot of his notions of power and anthropological constants, as he likes to call them, whether or not these are or like friend foe and so on and so forth, and whether or not these are metaphysical constructs or not, he seems to almost get them from this empirical sense by studying a lot of anthropology and sort of basing his basic analysis on, someone takes a position, and by doing that, they take a position against something else. And that's kind of how it seems to me looking at his bibliography and his, oeuvre and books and so on and so forth.
Yes, that's true. I mean, he studied very, very closely thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, but also German sociologists like Helmut Schelsky, Gehlen, and so on, where a lot of empirical stuff gets into. But the attempts by some German thinkers like Arnold Gehlen to found a kind of empirical philosophy without metaphysics, that was very close, I think, to Galen's approach here in this way. Maybe one should look at the social ontology for this kind of background, and he obviously invested a lot of energy into studying these things. But even then, if you go and look at what writers, thinkers, philosophers, sociologists write about man, you end up having to deal with metaphysical concepts as well.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say something a bit more about rationality. You treated skepticism, and rationality features pretty centrally in PK's book on the Enlightenment. And I was wondering if you could say something more about that and different sort of treatments in comparison to PK.
Okay, that's of course a little bit difficult because there's so much. I mean, the main thrust. There's one large chapter in his book on the Enlightenment about Cartesianism and anti-Cartesianism. Of course, he also takes into account Spinoza and others, and knew some of the German rationalists, if you like. And he thinks that obviously this kind of rationalism is sometimes linked to this mathematical concept of reality. So you study nature more geometrico, and reason then becomes a kind of also calculating faculty. But when you uh, uh, now there is this kind of tendency by claiming that rehabilitation of sensuality is the crucial thing, or the naturalness of man, then the faculty of reason is no longer the dominant one in terms of social life. You cannot claim that this is a kind of higher faculty in the sense that the vita contemplativa is superior to the vita activa, and uh, one would have to look a little bit more closely than I can do right now at the way that Kondylis deals with Kant, for example, and Kant's uh, let's say, precarious position, both with regard to empiricism and rationalism, and then the way that actually at the end of the Enlightenment book, Kondylis mentions and looks at thinkers like Johann Georg Hamann and Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who were, in a sense, strong opponents of this kind of rationalism of earlier Enlightenment figures, especially in Germany and Descartes. One could perhaps say that in 18th century German philosophy, there's a strong development away from Cartesianism and also Wolffianism towards a more empirical anthropology on the one hand, and a non-rational affirmation even of physical nature, sensuality, and so on. But this is all I can say about this right now.
Thank you very much. If there are any other questions, please also put them in the chat if you don't want to speak, and I can read it out loud. Mule asks, could you please elaborate on how Kondylis' view on Lemaitre is refuted,
His
how it is
view on
refuted?
His view on what?
Lemaitre.
La Mettrie.
Lemaitre.
Okay, yeah. Well, this now this is a very difficult issue because there have been discussions about this topic. In Germany, there has been a kind of freelance, non-academic philosopher who has tried to rehabilitate La Mettrie and published some of his writings. And he, at the time, I think that must have been in the 1980s, also had a correspondence with Kondylis because Kondylis was actually the first one that this particular person, his name was Lasker, came across La Mettrie, but then he was not content with Kondylis's interpretation because Kondylis thought that La Mettrie was such a kind of proponent of sensuality that he could be, because he refused all kinds of normative frames. He yeah, he tried to more or less bring him very close to the Marquis de Sade. And obviously, in the Marquis de Sade, as you also know from Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectics of Enlightenment, you get a kind of reductio ad absurdum, or a kind of nihilistic conclusion of the Enlightenment if it is merely sensual and there's no normative value that can be attached to anything that that restricts the free use of whatever desire comes into your mind. Now, the claim that this particular person, Lasker, and a more recently another philosopher in Germany made was that Kondylis did not actually study closely enough all the relevant writings of La Mettrie. And in this connection, there is the thesis that has been put forth that La Mettrie has developed a notion of, how could you say, a voluptuous virtue or virtuous voluptuousness, if you like, which is basically a kind of affirmation of yeah, kind of liberation of sexuality, but also um, linked to notions of happiness. And according to this interpretation, La Mettrie um, was not a nihilist, but actually a proponent of a certain concept of virtue that is linked to human nature and that is also linked to a critical analysis of societal norms and religious indoctrination, etc., etc. This I can't go into this more, but there are some uh, arguments I think that one could make that Kondylis was maybe um, too much relying on a traditional view of La Mettrie in this interpretation than one could make now. But this is also, of course, a reflection on the state of research at the time that he wrote his book, and that was the 1970s. And now, for example, La Mettrie studies have been much improved, I think, in recent decades. So perhaps that much about this particular issue.
Yeah, Mule says, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, I think we'll end the talk here. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.